Okay, thanks, Ollie. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next instalment of the UK in a Changing Europe economics panel. I hope our panelists will need no introduction, though we do seem to have lost, or I seem to have lost Jill Rutter somewhere. I'm hoping that she will turn up back eventually. We've got Ben Chew from the BBC, Gemma Tetlow from the Institute for Government, and our own Jonathan Portes. And just to kick us off, he says nervously, seeing if Jill's hiding somewhere and realising she's not. I just want to sort of turn to all of you and ask you where we are. Has the economy turned the corner? Are we on the glide path to recovery? Is everything going to be okay again soon? So where are we economically after what was a turbulent sort of 6 to 12 months? Small question. Who wants to start, Gemma?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
I mean, I think my basic answer would be a little bit yes, we have turned the corner, but mostly no. The yes part is that the new forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility do look much more rosy in the short term than what they're expecting in November. And this is particularly because energy costs have come down more sharply than they were previously expecting, and interest rates have come down more sharply. The expectation now is that actually we have very weak growth, slightly negative this year, but nothing like the nearly 1.5% decline in GDP that they were expecting in November. So we're facing a kind of flatlining this year rather than a recession, and then growth picking up more quickly than they were expecting. The no part of my answer is that actually looking, although they think the economy is going to be bigger in every year of their forecast than they thought back in November, the sort of medium-term picture of where they think the UK economy is going to be in terms of its potential for growth in the future is actually a bit worse than what they thought in November. So the UK is still facing really quite sluggish growth over the next few years, kind of back to the kind of sluggish growth that we had pre-pandemic. And in terms of how households are going to feel this year, even though the picture for the macro economy is quite a lot better this year because of lower energy prices and lower interest rates, actually that's not feeding through into a really much better picture for household incomes. So back in November, the OBR forecast that household incomes on average would fall in real terms this year by 7%. Their forecast is now a 6% fall in real terms incomes this year. And the reason households haven't benefited from some of the better economic news is that the government had in place policies that were kind of cushioning the impact of high energy prices on households. So the drop in energy prices similarly hasn't fed through that much to household incomes. So not really hugely better news, I would say, for sort of how people are actually going to feel this year.
Okay, well, that's brought me straight back to earth. Before I turn to whoever wants to go next, let me just say to those watching, do put your questions on Slido. My aspiration for this economics panel is that I don't have to think of any questions and that you provide them all. So do stick your questions in the Slido chat and I'll put as many of them as possible to the panelists. Who wants to go next, reflecting on where we are? Ben.
Yeah, I think, have we turned the corner? Well, yeah, I mean, everything Jeremy said was absolutely right. I think it's interesting if you look at the Bank of England's forecasts and the OBR's forecast, there is a marked difference in the path that the Bank of England set out in February and what the OBR set out recently. The OBR looks a lot more optimistic. Why? But you know, looking at digging into the detail, as Gemma said, on productivity growth, there's actually quite a bit of agreement between them both that our medium-term productivity outlook is pretty weak, certainly by pre-financial crisis rates of growth. So in that sense, neither of them see us really turning a corner and getting back to decent productivity growth. I think in all likelihood, in terms of the actual output path, the Bank of England will come more into line with the OBR, judging from the signals they were sending last week about not going into recession and in other ways as well. So I think they will come into line, but what they're coming into line with, as I said, is a pretty meager productivity growth outlook. So have we turned the corner? Well, it depends where you're talking about starting from and what your comparator is, as in all these things. I think the big picture is not great, whichever official forecast you're looking at. But what I would say is I think it's possible that we might have turned a corner in terms, not of the economy, but maybe in political economy, perhaps things are looking more rosy from that point of view. And I'm thinking here about the emphasis of both the Tories and the Labour on things that really will boost our productivity growth in the longer term, things like investment, things like planning reform, and a real sort of emphasis right across the piece that it's really growth that we need, productivity growth, and making that front and centre. I think you do find both parties in a pretty similar place. I mean, delivering that is obviously incredibly difficult, and that's internal politics of the parties and their electoral basis, not necessarily in favour of growth. So, but in terms of what they're arguing, I think they're more in line, and it does feel like some of the energy is going out of the sort of the Brexit de-alignment or deregulation for its own sake. So I think, yes, economics wise, I don't think we've turned a corner, but potentially a glimmer of hope on the political economy.
Blimey, staggering optimism there. You think someone's going to deliver planning reform? That is remarkable. Jill or Jonathan?
Shall I come in? Well, of course, if you think about making growth centrepiece, then you'll be regretting the loss of the sort of Liz Truss interregnum, which did put growth absolutely at the centre, but clearly didn't put a plausible way of achieving growth at the centre of its programme. So I think it's quite interesting. I mean, it's quite interesting. I thought that that Jeremy Hunt could hail in his budget that the OBR had said this was the biggest ever supply side boost that they'd scored in their time. And then when they said how big it was 0.2% of GDP. So it sort of shows that there's a lot of really heavy work to be done. I thought one of the things that's was quite interesting about the sort of budget, which I'm sure you want to come on to, was there'll be some very specific people who did get quite big specific benefits. So, our family WhatsApp group went a bit nuts with what was the benefit of the childcare move to people who were already paying for childcare, who saw this as actually lightening that burden quite significantly with slightly the wrongly aged children. Quite a lot of people, I think, will be regretting quite when they had their children because they missed the dates to max out on the benefits. But those are people paying anyway. So it's quite a big bonus if you think that that's going to come through and, childcare won't collapse entirely. Similarly, people who benefit from the pensions tax break or can benefit from it can see quite significant savings. But as Gemma said, for the sort of majority of people, the big impact is this massive decline in living standards. And there's some people, the bigger turning point clearly at some point, and last month wasn't it, is going to be when inflation starts taking that big drop down to get to the sort of quite low numbers that the OBR are saying it's going to be by the end of the year. But there are quite a lot of people who've still got pain to come, and particularly people who've got to refix their mortgages who haven't yet experienced the impact of the hike in mortgage rates or whatever. So I think in terms of people feeling good about the economy, there's quite a long way to go unless you're a very specific beneficiary of some of the very specific moves made in the budget. And the childcare one, of course, only comes in next April. So it's very important to have timed your children right to be a beneficiary of that.
Well, if we run out of questions, which frankly I don't think we will, I'll make a little speech about unpaid childcare, which I've developed very, very strong feelings on over the last 6 months. But Jonathan.
Yes, I think, look, short-term things are significantly better than they were 6 months ago. And that's almost entirely due to what's happened to energy prices, just as a lot of the bad things that were happening were due to the rise in energy prices. So short term and not much to do with UK government policy, either on the downside or the upside. Medium to long term, we clearly haven't turned the corner. The projections are, as both Ben and Gemma said, pretty terrible. The question really is whether, as Ben's glass has full version, that actually the political establishment is collectively woken up to the fact that we've had about 15 years of pretty mediocre growth, and that we need to do something about it, and it's broadly grasped what the problems are. The glass half empty version, of course, is that the political class has no idea how to actually deliver, as you said, Anand, planning reform and on investment, we've seen some just, quite bizarre decisions by the government and the Treasury on the sort of timing of investment, combined with an astonishing degree of mismanagement, as today's report on the HS2 station at Euston has revealed. So turning that around is not going to be easy. I do agree with Ben that the outbreak of sanity on Brexit and our relationship with Europe, first of all, removes a large potential downside in the short term, and then also gives a potential upside. It doesn't follow because there's still a lot of work to be done, but there clearly is a potential medium-term upside there if they can, either this government or the next one, can build on this in things like financial services and so on, for example.
Brilliant, thank you. HS2 proudly going from nowhere near Leeds to nowhere near Euston. It's getting better and better. But can I just say, Gary, you're a star, because I'm going to do all your questions because I like them all. So here's the first of them, which I love. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good would you rate how high would you rate the OBR's economic forecast to date? So, I mean, the root of this is the OBR any good at this? Just looking at the record, has the OBR tended to get things right or wrong? You don't have to do the scale of 1 to 10. It just appealed to me. Go on, Ben.
Well, I think if you look at the OBR's forecasts, they tend to cleave pretty closely to what the consensus is. And the consensus, you're looking at what specifically the one from the other week, they are a little bit more optimistic than the consensus, but they're pretty close to it. The Bank of England tends to be much more comfortable diverging from the consensus. So, I mean, that's the first point to say. I don't think they make any particularly big, bold calls. And then it's like, well, how good are they? Well, relative to what they replaced, i.e. the Treasury's forecasts, I think the OBR have some evidence that they are better. But these are obviously conditional forecasts, and we've had a lot of shocks. So it's pretty hard to judge. But I think most economic journalists like me would look at the OBR and think, that what you're getting from them is not a particularly big and bold call. It's one that's close to what most economists think is going to happen, and it's a pretty reasonable one at that.
I mean, let me add a supplementary that you could ignore if you want. But, when Ben said earlier that the OBR forecasts were a lot less gloomy than the Bank of England forecasts, as a political scientist, I immediately thought, well, that's because it's easier for the government to lean on the OBR than it is for them to lean on the Bank of England. I mean, is there any truth in that? Jonathan, you've unmuted, so.
Yeah, I don't think there's any truth in that. I mean, I agree with Ben. I think the OBR play it absolutely straight. And part of the reason for the gloominess of the Bank of England forecast actually was a completely bizarre decision to use the wrong forecasts for net migration, forecasts which they knew were wrong, but decided to use anyway. They even noted in a footnote that they were using the wrong ones. And that actually made quite a significant difference. There are some, there's funny things go on. I mean, I think the sort of interesting, Ben's right. The OBR does. The OBR takes the consensus basically, and does not see it as its job to make big, bold calls. And I think that's probably right, isn't it? I mean, the OBR's job is not to forecast, is not to go out of a limb and be contrarian. The interesting question is really whether what the political economy role of the OBR is now, and whether that constrains governments. It was designed to constrain governments, of course, but whether it constrains governments in a way which, for example, biases towards fiscal conservatism, or biases towards the sort of games that the Treasury is playing in the current budget. Now, my view is that, that it is ridiculous, that you shouldn't blame the OBR for that, right? The government set out a fiscal rule that debt should be falling in 5 years. It has, quote, produced a forecast, or it has produced a set of policies which the OBR has assessed as meeting that fiscal rule. But however, those policies are completely incredible. Nobody believes the government is, after all, going to put up fuel duty, which it would need to do to hit the target. Nobody believes that the government is going to cancel the 100% capital allowances after 3 years. All those are in the plans. The fact that the government has set out a target which is very susceptible to being gamed and is then gaming it is, I think, extremely unfortunate for economic policy. It is frankly, it is simply fraud on the taxpayer and the political process. It's disgraceful, but it's not fundamentally the OBR's problem. Now, you can argue that the OBR should perhaps have been a bit more outspoken and come out and said pretty much what I'm just saying, which is, yes, in principle, the government's policies meet our target, but frankly, they're just so politically absurd and ridiculous that we're not going to believe them, and we're going to assume that actually they don't happen because that's reality, and therefore the target will not be met. That would be quite a brave thing for the OBR to do, but you can argue they should have done it.
I look forward to the day when the OBR sounds like Jonathan.
I mean, well, Jonathan will remember as a former Treasury official that you didn't get the Treasury's forecast. You got what we always termed the Chancellor's forecast that accompanied the budget. And that was always a subject of quite interesting internal discussions when the Chancellor didn't quite believe what he was being offered as a first draft of the forecast by the Treasury forecasters. And that, of course, is the change with the OBR, that it's probably more like what the Treasury forecast would have been before the Chancellor got to say, well, I think growth is stronger than that. I do actually remember, way back when I was at the Treasury, there being an argument about how pessimistic about growth the Treasury was being, and the Chancellor saying, I don't believe it, I think the economy is performing better than this. And the Treasury saying, the Permanent Secretary saying, you're implying a completely ludicrous growth path through the rest of the year. And Chancellor saying, they always back revise the data. It's going to be okay. And the Treasury did put in the Chancellor's forecast, which was actually righter than the Treasury's initial forecast. So because he was more in touch, as he would always tell us, with the real economy than people sitting in Parliament Street, Horseguards Road now. So I think there is a sort of nuance there. I actually thought, notwithstanding what Jonathan has said, that the OBR could be stronger, that actually we did get more of that sort of, do you really believe it this time? I think this is a bit of a distinction between the Richard Hughes OBR and the Robert Choate OBR. The Robert Choate OBR seemed to be more prepared to stick to its remit, that it, only modelled announced government policies and believed if the government told them they would deliver those spending plans or stick to, actually raise fuel duty, it would. Whereas there are bits in this time's EFO where you can see some eyebrows being raised, on fuel duty, where they do point out that, they may be doing that, but no government in recent memory has raised fuel duty. And then they do have their graph about the very slim headroom, even on these implausible assumptions. So I do think there's a bit of that going on. Whether it's reasonable to expect to go much further, I'm not sure. But
I agree. I mean, I wasn't criticizing Richard or the OBR. I think they're moving, they're moving in the direction, in that direction. And my point was that, one shouldn't be criticizing the OBR for, imposing this sort of fiscal conservatism, or indeed these games. That's the choice of the government, and the role of the OBR is to call them out. And the question really, as is said, is how quickly and how fast they do that. And I entirely agree that they have been moving progressively in that direction, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate for them to jump now to saying the sort of things that I've just said.
I totally agree. I think it is interesting, as Jill was saying, that the OBR had put in that table showing what the forecast would look like if you assumed they don't do the fuel duty increases, which no Chancellor has for the last decade. And I think that came out of a bit of an interaction between the OBR and the Treasury Select Committee, who raised this question and asked if there's more the OBR could do that. So I think it's quite an interesting example of where that kind of, not only the OBR, but the Treasury Select Committee and Parliament taking more of an interest in this can put a bit more pressure on the government to be a bit more honest.
Brilliant, thank you. And just going back to something you said, Jonathan, it's Gary again, on the degree to which changing immigration rules are driving the productivity forecast. If you just want to reflect for a moment on the relationship between some of these forecasts and the economic performance and immigration.
Well, they're not driving the productivity forecast at all, is the short answer, right? So the OBR has decided to assume that immigration has no impact on productivity, either positive or negative. That is that, and what do I mean by that? It assumes that immigration adds to the labor force, adds the number of people in work, but has no effect, either positive or negative, on output or output per hour, output per worker or output per hour. Now, you can argue that point one way or the other, but their current view is that the evidence isn't strong enough to assume that immigration either increases or decreases productivity. What immigration does do, of course, because it adds to the working population, is add to the number of workers and the number of hours worked, and hence the total output of the economy. And that obviously makes the numbers look better. You have higher GDP, you have higher tax revenues, and while you do have some sort of direct increases in public spending as a result, because you have more people, they don't come online quick enough or in large enough magnitude to offset that. So overall, immigration makes the economic growth numbers look better, and it also makes the tax and spending numbers look better as well. And that has been quite a boost. And the OBR went from assuming net migration of about 100,000 a year just a year ago to now assuming about an average of about 250,000 a year over the forecast period. So that's a pretty big increase, and it does improve the numbers. It's broadly, I think, that I and most other followers of the immigration trends would agree that, immigration is just as difficult to forecast as the economy, possibly even more difficult. But if you have to forecast something, and they do, then this is a pretty reasonable number.
Does anyone else want to come in? Ben?
Yeah, I think what we've learned about the OBR over the years is that it's always going to be inherently conservative about the impact of government policy on things like medium-term productivity growth. That's true for, as Jonathan was saying, for the impact of immigration, but you can also see it when talking about these supply-side reforms that Jeremy Hunt has put through on getting people back to work. They add about 1/5% of GDP over the horizon, which isn't spectacular and doesn't cover the cost of all these measures, either in public finance terms or the boost to growth. But if you actually read what the OBR is saying, as Jill mentioned, it was saying this is the biggest material increase in productivity over the horizon as a result of policy measures. That's as close as you're going to get as a thumbs up in terms of the OBR saying, will this help the UK economy grow in the medium term or not? So I think you should analyse the words as well as the figures actually in terms of what it thinks it's going to help the economy grow. And just to come back to this idea that the OBR could be a bit more assertive about its belief about whether these various policy plans will be enacted on fuel duty or investment allowances or whatever. I think it has the leeway now in a way that it probably didn't before the last September's mini budget debacle to do that. It has the power, and the government isn't going to say, how dare you get back in your box, in a way that it might have done behind the scenes before that, because it has, everyone understands that it's part of the framework now. Remember, I think we talked about the stories which were leaking out from the Treasury when Rishi Sunak was still Chancellor, sort of suggesting that he hates the OBR, that kind of briefing, pretty clearly designed to undermine it and sort of intimidate it. I don't think you'd get that now. So if the OBR did, as I said, want to be a bit more assertive about, not saying that these things won't happen, but sort of being a bit more explicit about the likelihood that they won't, I think it could probably do that.
Excellent, thank you. Just a related question. The questioners are now learning the way to my heart, because this anonymous questioner says, building on Gary's question, knowing that would therefore get asked. Is there a sense, and I suppose this is Jonathan again, of the impact of ending freedom of movement specifically? So what the impact of that has been on specific industries? Has that red tape? So you've argued, I know, that there's a positive effect of the new immigration system, but do we have a sense of the impact of losing some of these EU workers because it's not as easy for them to come?
Well, we have the sort of the analysis that John Springford at the Centre for European Reform and I did about numbers of EU workers and broadly what sectors they have been lost from. So we estimate a shortfall of several 100,000 with a large degree of uncertainty, and it's particularly in the sectors you might expect: accommodation, food services, transport, logistics, to some extent, some areas of manufacturing. What the economic cost of that is very hard to measure. There clearly is some economic cost, both in the short term as firms and sectors adjust, and perhaps in the medium term from the sort of the loss of a relatively flexible, relatively skilled labor force, skilled in the sense of people who are well suited to doing the jobs that employers wanted them to do. Quantifying that is very difficult, and certainly not something that I'm ambitious enough to try and do yet. But there clearly is an economic cost. My sense is that the economy will probably adjust reasonably quickly, and that the long run economic cost will not be huge, but it's difficult to say.
Okay, I'm going to keep going on unless someone waves at me. No one's waving at me. Another anonymous here. Jill will have assumptions about who anonymous is and where they work, but how do you square the fact that you lot are talking about UK outlook as sluggish and disappointing, yet the OECD says our long-term growth prospects are better than France and Germany? No pressure. I mean, I can rephrase that slightly, which is, comparatively, how are we doing?
I mean, well, to start with, the OECD's GDP forecasts are to some extent driven, very much as the OBRs, right? As I was just explaining, by population growth. So our population growth, because of that higher immigration, the growth of the workforce is, I think, significantly higher than in either France or Germany. So just arithmetic, I'd be surprised if they think they're claiming that our growth forecasts in per capita or productivity terms are higher than Germany, although the questioner is welcome to correct me if I'm wrong. But that's true. There is, sluggish productivity is not just a UK problem. It is, to some extent, a European problem as well. So it's true that and I think it's correct to say that the UK is not sort of doing in overall GDP terms. The UK is not doing catastrophically with respect to France and Germany. That is a mistake, as I said when I was commenting on Mr. Carney's dodgy statistics. But that doesn't mean that we're doing well. We're clearly not doing well. We're doing at best, we're doing as well as other countries in Europe that also face structural problems, as Germany does, for example, with respect to energy supply and the energy transition, as France does with respect to high levels of youth unemployment and an excessive burden of taxation in some respects, and problems to do with early retirement and pensions and so on. So yes, all countries in Europe, all the developed countries in Europe have their problems. So I think the basic point would be that we're doing at best as well as other countries which have significant problems, and we'd like to be able to address them. And then moving, of course, from the GDP, the other side of it is of course that in terms of the social impacts of that low growth, we seem to be doing considerably worse than France and Germany, right? So lower and middle income households have had significantly lower income growth, face significantly lower living standards than similar households in France and Germany. The quality of our public services has degraded in a way which is simply not the case in France and Germany. And we have problems of extreme poverty and deprivation that again are not the case in France and Germany. So overall, it's hard to paint a terribly optimistic picture of at least the immediate prospects. I don't know whether anyone has anything to add to that.
Anyone else want to chip in on this? on the sort of comparative picture, how we're doing relative to others? I mean, I will come back to this a bit if we do something on Brexit, because of course the comparative picture is quite important there.
I mean, just to very quickly reinforce really what Jonathan was saying, it's about the levels of income really, rather than the relative growth rates. I mean, you always hear Jeremy Hunt say, "Oh, we've grown as fast actually as France and Germany since the Brexit vote since 2010." It's really quite meaningless in terms of what people really care about, which is their incomes, as Jonathan says, public services. So I think I'd take it back to what I was saying earlier about the political economy of this. I mean, despite him making those talking points, if you listen to what Jeremy Hunt says and what people like John Glenn say, and even what Rishi Sunak says, there is this realization that actually there is a problem here. You can trade statistics, but the underlying understanding, I think the penny has dropped, that we are falling behind and we are not catching up with where we would hope to be as a country and economy, and also relative to our big European peers. So I think, yes, I think you look at levels rather than growth rates in terms of, and look at the things that people really care about.
Okay, there's another comparative question here, which is that the president of the Bundesbank last week was talking about the need to focus on profit restraint. And in this country, we talk a lot about wage restraint. Have we got something to learn from the Germans in this regard, do you think? Don't be shy, Jonathan.
I mean, I think, well, of course, the governor of the Bank of England did say precisely that last week, right? He said businesses shouldn't be putting up, having a few months ago saying that workers who wanted higher wages would be stoking inflation. He then said that businesses that put up prices were stoking inflation. I'm afraid that I have a sort of slightly boring economist view on that, which is that it is not the job of politicians or central bank governors to tell people that they should be settling for lower wages, or to tell businesses how to set their prices. It's the job of the politicians and the Bank of England to make sure that the economy is stable and that inflation is under control. And if there are problems with businesses charging prices that are, quote, too high, or making profits that are, quote, too high, then it's the job of either politicians to change the tax system or the regulators to change the competition markets framework, so that businesses aren't able to profiteer in that way. And then telling businesses that they're behaving irresponsibly is frankly not doing, if they do that, then they're not doing their jobs. So that's sort of my view on that one, which I say is a fairly boring liberal economist take.
Anyone else? Gemma?
I mean, I'd agree with Jonathan that, I suppose, just to broaden it out a bit, there are interesting changes going on with the structure of the economy that the government and regulators are having to get to grips with. In particular, the rise of digital markets and digital giants who sort of operate in quite a different way, and the sort of nature of market power in those markets is quite different from traditional markets, which the Competition and Markets Authority is used to regulating. So there is a whole agenda within government about how government can stay on top of regulating competition and ensuring there isn't sort of excess profit opportunities for those kind of companies in the modern economy, which is definitely a thing that government is trying to grapple with at the moment.
Just to add, Anand, I mean, I think it is quite interesting if sort of shares going to capital as opposed to labour. It's one of the things that, I think has been exposed through the cost of living crisis in the UK, is the consequences of our income distribution sort of quite skewed towards the lower end, and how many people seem to have very little discretionary income or the ability to withstand economic shocks. Now, what the story is on how you transition to the sort of, I think probably desired by everybody, higher wage economy, so that you can have people who actually aren't sort of just about managing, but are actually sort of getting by quite reasonably, have a sort of modest level of savings and feel able to manage through that, I think is one of the really big challenges. But it does seem to be, because as Ben and John was saying, because if you look at the levels, they're significantly higher in France and Germany. They don't seem to have experienced the same sort of squeeze maybe partly because of the way they reacted, as the UK has, where we do seem to have quite a lot of people who are in quite a sort of precarious financial position and can't cope with a sudden big shock to a bill.
Well, Ben.
Yeah, just to very quickly on the Andrew Bailey debate about whether he's right to sort of tell businesses not to put prices up and workers not to ask for pay rises. I mean, as Jonathan said, there's a sort of, the classical view is like it's up to the market. It's not for him to tell people or firms what to ask for. His job is to just control inflation via the interest rate. I think that's a fair enough viewpoint. There is another viewpoint, which I think is a little bit more sympathetic, which I probably cleave to a little bit, which is you could argue that he's simply communicating what the bank's forecast is, which is for inflation to come down quite rapidly. And this is a way of conveying that into expectations and encouraging people to moderate their either price increases or their wage demands based on what it thinks is the central view of the central bank about inflation. And simply, yeah, it's a communication thing rather than anything more than that.
Well, there's a very nice segue here to the most popular question. I'm not convinced any of you want to answer it, but I'll give you it anyway, and you can see, which is, do you think the bank has gone too far too fast in raising interest rates? This is a trade-off between inflation and sort of stimulating the economy. Do you have a feeling on whether the bank has gone too fast? If you were on the MPC, would you have voted for the rise? No, I didn't think you'd be anything that keen.
I mean, you know, look, if we were on the MPC, we would have spent 2 days crawling through the entrails of the data, so we might have had different views. But if you asked me now, if you forced me to vote now, I would have said I would have voted against. Okay. I mean, you know, inflation is going to come down very hard, very fast, unless something happens that pushes up energy prices again.
Okay, moving on. Is the labour market the most significant constraint on growth in the medium term? From Richard Whitman. We hear a lot about labour shortages and the like. Gemma.
It's certainly become more of an issue in the last few years through COVID. And one of the reasons that the OBR forecast looks a bit worse in the medium term than it did back in November was one of the things that got downgraded in the latest OBR forecast was that they're slightly more pessimistic about labour force participation over the next few years, essentially assuming that there's been quite a sharp fall in labour force participation post-pandemic. And they've essentially now baking that in, assuming that some of that is more permanent than they thought back in November. So I think it is an important constraint, not just in terms of migration, because as Jonathan said, actually they're expecting more net migration than they were previously, but actually just the demographics of the country. And whereas we'd had sort of 20 years pre-pandemic where we'd gone quite a long way towards increasing labour force participation amongst lots of groups, including mothers of young children, the disabled population and older workers. Actually, the pandemic, we've gone into reverse, particularly on that group of older workers, with a lot more people entering early retirement. So I think the question about the labour force, and particularly labour force participation of people who are already in this country, has become a more acute issue constraining growth over the next few years than it was pre-pandemic.
Though, of course, as Jonathan's recent report showed, we have got these quite remarkable figures on sort of broad shifts in public opinion on immigration. We'll see how long that lasts, but there has been a bit of a sea change. How key to our future economic prospects are developments in the US and EU, particularly around IRA and whatever the EU does? We seem to have sort of entered a period of massive levels of state intervention in the economy. And does that just mean this is a sort of very unlucky time to have left the European Union when the EU is engaged in this sort of public spending? I mean, how crucial is having a decent response to this to our economic prospects, do you think? Or should we just watch them spend the money badly?
I think it is important. These are really quite big programs that the US and the EU are embarking on. The challenge to the UK and sort of how to respond to this is, unlike the US and the EU, which are big markets, which essentially they have a credible chance of being the world leader in these areas that they're investing money in. They have large domestic markets that they can serve. The UK is very different. We're a much smaller, more open economy. So it's not simply a case of do the UK version of the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever the EU comes up with. We've got to do something a bit different, identifying those areas where perhaps scale of domestic market isn't quite as important because we're a much smaller country, perhaps identifying those areas where we have more of a natural comparative advantage because we're just not going to be able to compete head to head with the scale that the US and the EU have.
Go on, Ben.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the idea of what I was saying before about, what's the argument? We need an industrial strategy. I think this cements the case for an industrial strategy, and one that sticks, and one that actually isn't just chucked out on a whim by a chancellor or a prime minister. As Gemma says, we're never going to be able to match the scale of investments by either the EU or the US. So that's a non-starter, but it does suggest that we do need to have a serious industrial strategy to focus our resources as a nation on the areas where there really is potential for us to excel and to drive medium-term productivity growth, long-term productivity growth. And I think what the implications of the US subsidies and the inevitable EU response will be to cement that belief that it's time to get serious about industrial strategy in the UK. So I think hopefully that will be the response.
So I think it's really interesting because at one level, you could say if they're prepared to throw their taxpayers' money at all of these things, our consumers can just benefit from slightly cheaper imports. The question then is, what are we going to export to supply? I thought there was a really interesting straw in the wind about where the UK might be beginning to work through its post-Brexit position in the letter that Patrick Vallance wrote to the Chancellor with the sort of interim findings. He hasn't published the full report yet of his life sciences review. Remember in the November autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt set up 5, technology reviews to work out how the UK could benefit from post-Brexit regulation. And it was really interesting. In the life sciences one, they set up this new regime where they basically said, if the European Medicines Agency or the FDA, a respected regulator licenses a medicine, we'll just, subject to some due diligence, we'll license it too. You won't need to duplicate all of that to get permission to introduce it into the UK market. We will refocus, if you like, the resource that frees from the MHRA, our medicines regulator, from duplicating those processes, and also the risk that people won't bother to apply to the UK as well after they've done US and EU compliance. We'll refocus our resources onto much more innovative approaches, sort of rapid testing, rapid approvals of more innovative medicines and things like that, where you could get weighed down in the bureaucracy of trying to get through the FDA, multiple compliance, the EMA and stuff like that. And I thought that was actually quite an interesting sort of dawning realization of how the UK needed to do things differently if it was going to have an offer that couldn't be the giant market regulatory hegemon offer of the US and the EU. And I think it's quite interesting how you then reflect that thinking. It's quite interesting. I was doing a sort of in conversation at the Institute for Government, Anand, on Friday with Patrick.
Doing that on our air.
And with Patrick Vallance on Friday. And he was pointing out that actually one of the key things in his report, though, was that you could do this sort of early divergence, but the long run answer was going to be convergence, whether it was through international product standards and stuff like that. And that you would be hoping is that you've taken a bit of a lead there in setting the tone. I think it'd be quite interesting to see the extent to which that thinking starts to take hold in Whitehall of, where actually do we need to deploy our more limited resources to give us bang for the buck, and where do we just sort of free ride on what other people are doing?
As we're now in the plug section of the event, let me just say that we did a debate last week on the economics of Brexit that you can find on our website. And whilst I was slightly disappointed by the fact that it didn't lead to a lovely consensus between both sides of the debate about where we got to, it did have some interesting snippets about these sorts of issues, about where the economic benefits might come from, how they stack up against potential economic costs, and so on. If we end up with a minute before the end, I might ask Jonathan what he made of that debate, but we've got so many questions for now. I'm just going to keep going. So apparently the SNP event has just started, and I've been holding off with this question in the hope that I could tie it with an announcement as to who won, but I think that we're going to run out of time first. But the question is, I suppose basically is, you know, does this leadership contest have any economic consequences for the UK? I mean, you know, to what extent does a change of leadership in Scotland matter economically, either to Scotland or to the UK as a whole? Any thoughts on this, anyone? You're done, Gemma.
Yeah. Oh, no. Okay. I was just going to say, in terms of big picture economics, I think there's a limit to how much it can impact, because the fiscal framework within which Scotland operates essentially limits the degree to which the Scottish government can do anything very different in terms of big economic policies or fiscal stance from what the UK government is doing for England. So, I mean, I think the big sort of risk or difference that it could generate is if that affects what the chances are of Scotland ultimately voting for independence and leaving the union altogether, which obviously would have major implications for both parts of the union.
Jill?
Well, I think, I mean, as Gemma says, I mean, one question is the election of any one candidate likely to make it, you know, that we get a vote on independence of associated sort of blight and uncertainty and risks around that sooner rather than later, or indeed make it more likely that the independence vote would be won, though actually the tenor of the SNP conference seems to be a bit more with a sort of, you know, delayers and build consensuses and concentrate on sorting Scotland out as, I think, than that they will see when the result, then there's sort of, you know, rush full tilt into independence and showdown to the British government. And I think all candidates now are slightly backing away from a showdown with the British government over Section 35. I think, in a sense, one of the things that I think is a benefit of devolution is what called in the past of devolution as a policy laboratory. And it is quite interesting where devolved governments manage to do things differently. We haven't seen very much of that really on the economic front. We have seen it on some areas of social policy. It's quite interesting. There was a report, I think, last week showing that the Scots introduction of minimum unit pricing for alcohol had seemed to have had quite positive effects on the performance of their health service, you know, reduced death, alcohol abuse, massive problem in Scotland. So that might be an issue that other governments, I think Cardiff's already followed, but other, you know, the UK government might ultimately want to look at as an experiment. Obviously, it controls drinks duty in a rather random walk way. So of the candidates who seems most interested in what can we do to boost the Scottish economy and might actually, you know, experiment a bit in an interesting way, I think that would be Kate Forbes, who is the only one who's made the economy really the centerpiece of her campaign. So I think, you know, if she's there, it would be quite interesting to see if she does take Scotland off on a sort of distinctive economic tract, and whether there was anything there that the Scots might do that might ultimately be of interest to the rest of the UK.
Anyone else want to come in, Ben?
Yeah, on the economics of independence, which is obviously the really big implication of any of this, we've in some ways come on a quite a strange economic round trip when it comes to the oil price. You know, in the referendum in 2014, it was like the argument from the nationalists was we've got all this oil revenue and that will underwrite independence. And then obviously the oil price collapsed and now it's come back up again. But look, if you believe, as the Scottish government believes, we are going to net zero and Scotland's going to be forefront of that, then you can't count on those oil prices lasting, or those oil revenues lasting and underwriting independence in any other way. And then the other big change, of course, is Brexit since the last referendum. And if an independent Scotland desired, as its leaders say they want to do, Scottish nationalist leaders say want to go back into the European Union, well, they're going back into the single market and currency union, and they're putting a hard border between Scotland and England, where the preponderance of its trade is done. So that's a huge economic implications there. I mean, I would just point to, you know, public finances projections and underlying analysis from the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that they've got a pretty big budget deficit in Scotland. that they would have to close, not necessarily day one after independence, but at some stage, and that will be painful. That's not to say it shouldn't be done, but that's the underlying fiscal reality an independent Scotland would face.
I mean, talking about net zero, for those who've missed it, the recent ongoing EU debate about the internal combustion engine has just been so much fun. People changing their minds at the 11th hour and some rather angry exchanges. But anyway, just, I mean, in a sense, circling back to where we started, which is sort of the area of political economy, we've got a question from Keith Best, which is, does the panel think the Chancellor has left himself enough room for pre-election tax cuts?
The headroom against the main fiscal rule, which is this debt falling as a share of national income in 5 years' time, was incredibly small compared to even what previous chancellors have given themselves. So there's essentially nothing there, and Jeremy Hunt gave away some money to do the childcare policy and to have the fuel duty freeze again. So if he's really hoping for pre-election tax cuts, then two things could change in the autumn that might make that more feasible or give him a bit more space. One is that the forecast could get better again, in which case he'd have a bit more money to play around with. The second thing is that the date at which the fiscal rules get judged roll forward one more year. So he'll be on a slightly more downward sloping bit of the debt path trajectory at that point, which would just mechanically, even if nothing else changes, give him a bit more room to play with. But it's back to the point Jonathan was making earlier about the extent to which this is a well-framed fiscal rule for actually holding a chancellor to kind of adhere to fiscal sustainability as opposed to sticking to the letter of the rule, but kind of slightly fudging around the margins of it.
Absolutely. Remember, the nature of the rule means actually that when the 5-year debt target is binding, you can do pretty much what you like in the next couple of years, right? If you want to hand out free money, you can hand out free money.
But this, I was going to say, but this, Anand, is where it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the OBR shouting out completely implausible plans post-election, which effectively they signed off, I think, Jonathan, didn't they? In sort of 2015, they put in what looked like an absolutely nuts growth path for public spending after the election that George Osborne had written in. And
we do have coming, it's a very tight assumption about public spending growth beyond the next election in the current set of forecasts as well. It's something like 1% real terms growth. That's a fall from sort of 4% a year that we're doing over this spending review period. So it already looks a little bit implausible.
Also, I was just going to say, underlying the question is this idea that pre-election tax cuts would work, in a kind of electoral sense. Taxes will have gone up considerably over the course of this parliament, inevitably. You just look at the OBR box on the fiscal drag impacts, £29 billion extra taken in income tax just from freezing those thresholds. Is it plausible that people are going to look at that record and feel that record and say, oh, well, he's going to take a little bit off the taxes that they've raised over the past 5 years, therefore I'm more inclined to vote for the Conservative Party? I mean, I just find it a little bit implausible that these have this mechanistic effect of saying pre-election tax cuts, that's a great vote.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because they seem intent on going to the people with the message of, regardless of what we happen to have done over the last few years, we really, really believe in a small state and low taxes. And it's an interesting question as to whether or not.
Yeah, so I think that's right. The political and economic choice is really, of course, they will announce some new things in the next year and a half, some of which will be sort of designed to improve their electoral chances. I think the question is actually whether, will those be tax cuts, which risks the reaction that Ben has pointed out, or will it actually be in addressing the non-credibility of some of the public spending plans and saying, actually, no, we recognize that there are areas of there are public services which have been run down too far and where we need to do something about them. I mean, I think, there are limits to which the public is going to be persuaded by saying, well, rather than repairing a clearly broken, dysfunctional criminal justice system, what we're going to do is outlaw laughing gas, I think that's probably not going to be credible to most people.
And basically, we can already assume there's one tax cut that's bound to happen, which is that they won't impose and they won't index fuel duty next year, because to go through the entire, 13, 14 years in office with not raising it and then suddenly raise it in the last year of Parliament, I think, and I think they calculate they couldn't get it through. I mean, this sort of goes to the cost of Robert Halfon, and that parliamentary constraint on taxation is really quite interesting.
But it's hard to roll back new things you've introduced. So these new childcare things, for instance, once they're in place, I mean, politically getting rid of them is virtually impossible. I can report that Hamza Youssef is apparently smiling.
Right.
So there we go. But I mean, I surprised myself recently by I read Paul Johnson's book, and it's such an economist book in some ways, because it just says, if only sensible, basically I read it as saying, if only sensible economists rather than politicians were in charge of this, there are so many ways we can do this better. And one of the questions it sort of raised with me is, has economic policy making become worse, or has it always been, because of politics, this dysfunctional? I mean, I've reached that age now where I think things were better, even though when I was young, it was the early 70s. So there's absolutely no credible empirical support for this. But have the Brexit wars, have the politicization of all sorts of things, has that sort of changing balance between politics and economics come to mean that economic policy making is even more short-term and dysfunctional than it used to be? Or is this like it's always been? Sorry, I know that's a horrible question to pose, but I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on it.
I don't feel like I've been around long enough to fundamentally.
Yes, Gemma, you're young, great. Okay.
I'm really not that young, but I mean, I've definitely thought about this in the context of tax policy making, because we've done quite a bit of work on this and kind of thinking about, were there eras in the past when there was a sort of more coherent approach to tax policy making? I do look back at the 1980s and think there were big things done then that really radically overhauled the structure of our tax system, a shift away from direct taxation towards indirect taxation, aligning capital gains and income tax rates, and kind of Nigel Lawson particularly making a really sort of principled case for some pretty big changes to the tax system in a way that I can't imagine a chancellor these days doing similar types of things. So part of me does think something is a bit different now that makes that kind of radical reform less possible. I suppose my slight sort of hesitation on that is I think the economic and fiscal picture at that time was somewhat different. We didn't have some of the pressures of public service spending of an aging population, which just mean that governments now have that much less space to play with. So it's a lot easier to do radical things when you can give some money away to buy off the losers. And I think is much more constrained now and does affect what's possible for ministers to do now.
I mean, that being said, we are governed by a party that is more fundamentally divided on the basics of economic policy than any governing party I can remember. So it might be different. I mean, Labour's got many problems of its own, obviously, but one of them isn't that level of economic division that you see.
No, I think that's true. And probably although we've had 14 years of Conservative governments, if you'd asked the Prime Minister and Chancellor of each of the incarnations of those Conservative governments, if you were given a complete free pass, what's the radical thing you would do on the tax system, they'd probably all have given you quite different answers on that. So I guess that does say there's an extent to which knowing what direction you want to pull in has not been.
The counter argument to Gemma's obviously is to say, well, look, things are, that things have become such a mess that hopefully that in the next Parliament, whoever is Prime Minister or Chancellor, they will have to make some fairly significant reforms to the tax system, because we need, we all, I suspect, agree that demography and other pressures mean that taxes are going to have to be, and the sort of unsustainability of the current path of the public finances means that taxes probably have to go up even more. And that just isn't deliverable politically with a system that is as complicated, burdensome, messy, unfair, disincentivizing in various pernicious ways as the current one. And therefore, as in at least some areas of economic policy post 1979, Thatcher had a sort of burning platform to make some fairly radical changes. That will be the case for the, as I say, in the next parliament as well. That's the sort of optimistic way of looking at it. Things are so bad that you are going to have to get some degree of radical reform, and that's certainly what I have been saying. Is that, look, you know, we do need to raise more tax, medium to long term. We just are not going to be able to do that with our current system. We can't keep on putting up taxes on income. We will have to simplify and do things rather differently, and I certainly hope that's correct.
Well, I can. So, are we not going till 2:15?
No, we go till 2 now. That's why it's the lunch hour.
All right.
But you can go.
Well, I was going to say, clearly, I can offer longevity over having seen tax policy making, and Jonathan and I indeed worked on tax policy for Conservative chancellors. I think chancellors feel themselves a bit more locked in now. There are more areas, I think, where they sort of won't go. We sort of completely lost the ability to put up income tax rates, which is really annoying. So you can do what the OBR helpfully pointed out was the equivalent of a 4 pence in the pound increase in income tax, but you do it through tax thresholds rather than do it that. We also have the sort of lock, you know, one of the big successes of the last 34 years has been the decrease in pensioner poverty, but we now have an effective, you know, pensioner lock on an awful lot of policies, which, you know, possibly isn't where the real, you know, problems are these days. If you look at the sort of struggles of sort of families of young children, things like that. So I think there's some really, really difficult things. It was quite interesting that in their sort of disaster scenario for Brexit, the Bank of England modelled what they call the New Zealand case, and the sort of example of somebody doing radical tax reform was New Zealand in the late 1980s doing that under the Rutter Douglas government, when they realized that, you know, they had to come to terms with the effect of the loss of their biggest market when the UK joined the common market in 1973. And but that took took them 15 years to get round to saying we actually have to do an absolutely root and branch reform of all this, and they did that. It sort of has held for quite a long time. They have a very different, much simpler structure than we do, but I think that's the danger of sort of slow puncture rather than sort of massive crisis. It never gives you quite the burning platform to do the sort of radical reform. You know, and that was actually the shame of the Truss experiment, is if they'd wanted to do something really bold and imaginative on the tax system, just cutting rates wasn't the thing to do. There was sort of some really sort of interesting things they could have been doing, but you couldn't have cobbled it together in 3 weeks, having just sacked your permanent secretary.
All right, we have run out of time. In fact, I've gone over, for which I apologise. Thank you all for sending in your questions. We'll meet again in a quarter, so in a few months' time. So do come back and put your questions. But thanks most of all to all of you, Gemma, Jill, Ben and Jonathan. I thought that was fascinating, particularly the bits about politics, I have to say. And I very, very much look forward to hopefully having you back on this panel in a few months' time. But in the meantime, take care. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.